stars died that night across the spiral arms of the galaxy, their ancient light consumed not by the hunger of black holes or the slow entropy of time, but by something far more deliberate and terrifying. Whole constellations flickered and dimmed as if touched by cosmic frost, their radiance swallowed by a presence that moved between worlds with the patience of a predator taught to wait. On 1,000 imperial worlds, astropaths screamed themselves into silence, their minds brushing against something that defied all classification. Not the ravenous cacophony of the great devourer they knew and feared, but hunger made obedient, desire shaped by an alien will, into something resembling mercy. The phenomenon spread like ripples through dark water, each wave carrying whispers of a fleet that devoured only what it chose, that spared what it deemed worthy of salvation, and in that selective consumption lay a horror greater than any mindless appetite. We truly love and care for you, our listeners, as you join us in this tale of ambition and consequence. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. In the deep void, where no star had shone for 60 million years, the tomb world of Keth Morneth stirred from its deathless slumber. Pyramidal structures carved from blackstone that drank light itself pulsed with energies older than human civilization, their quantum hearts beating in rhythm with technologies that could reshape reality at will. Within the deepest sepulchre of this necropolis, where the very air crystallized with cold that had nothing to do with temperature, Firan Zarak, the silence bringer, awakened not to the customary hum of resurrection protocols, but to an echo that should not exist. It was the phantom sensation of rain on skin he no longer possessed, the memory of water falling on a world whose name had crumbled to dust along with the flesh that once housed his consciousness. Zarak rose from his sarcophagus with movements that spoke of eons spent in contemplation, his form a masterwork of Necron engineering, where each servo and actuator had been crafted to perfection. Yet something in his bearing suggested the ghost of mortality that haunted all who had undergone the great sleep, the fragments of a former self that had somehow survived the biotransference that stripped away everything soft and vulnerable. The living metal of his skull bore engravings that shifted and flowed like liquid thought, marking him as one of the few who retained pieces of their original consciousness through the Citan's harvest. In his emerald fire eyes burned something that should have been scoured away by that ancient bargain, the memory of compassion twisted now into a cold desire for order that he mistook for mercy. The corridors of his tomb palace stretched before him like the ribs of some titanic beast, their walls lined with hieroglyphs that told the story of the Necrontyre's fall and rise in symbols that hurt to perceive. Canoptek scarabs scuttered in the shadows, their sensors tracking his every movement with mechanical devotion, while the air hummed with barely contained energies of technologies that predated the birth of stars. Yet Zarak's attention focused on a single destination, the heart of his domain, where his greatest work awaited inspection, where ambition had taken the form of blasphemy so profound it made the ancient gods weep tears of liquid metal. The Neurothrone chamber rose before him like a cathedral dedicated to the marriage of death and hunger, its blackstone ribs arcing toward a vault that seemed to contain infinity itself. At its center, suspended within a web of null-field generators and psychic dampeners, hung the prize that had cost him 3 centuries of planning, and the sacrifice of an entire hive fleet to obtain. The Norn Queen writhed within her crystalline prison, her massive form a testament to the Tyranid's perfect evolution for consumption and adaptation. Yet here she was something unprecedented, a creature of the Hive Mind, severed from its collective voice for the first time in her existence. Zarak approached the throne with the measured pace of a supplicant approaching an altar, watching as the Norn Queen's countless eyes tracked his movement with an intelligence no longer clouded by the collective will of her species. In the silence between them, broken only by the hum of containment fields and the soft whisper of recycled atmosphere, a conversation continued that had been ongoing for decades, part interrogation, part education, part confession of sins not yet committed. Mother of silence, he spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the chamber's living metal walls. You will learn to choose your prey, as I have chosen mine. Together, we will teach hunger to discriminate, to spare the innocent while consuming only those who have surrendered their souls to the warp's embrace. The moral ambiguity of his project was a shadow that lengthened with every passing cycle, a weight that pressed against the fragments of conscience he had somehow retained through biotransference. He remembered the horror of that transformation, the agony of shedding flesh, the silent scream of his soul as it was flayed from his body and encased in cold metal. He remembered the promise of immortality, the allure of power, the desperate hope that this metamorphosis would allow him to protect his people from the encroaching darkness. Now, millennia later, that promise had curdled into an obsessive drive to control, to dictate the terms of existence for an entire galaxy, to impose his vision of selective mercy upon a universe that recognized only strength and survival. The Norn Queen's response came not in words, but in the subtle shift of bioelectric patterns across her carapace, a language of flesh and synapse that Zarak had learned to read like ancient scripture. Her consciousness, no longer diluted by connection to the vast collective above, had begun to coalesce into something approaching individuality, though he did not yet recognize the profound implications of this development. She had begun to dream individual dreams, to experience memory as distinct from instinct, and in that unprecedented awakening lay the seeds of a rebellion that would ultimately force him to confront the most fundamental question of all, whether love meant holding on or letting go, whether salvation could ever truly be imposed by force, and whether a weapon designed for destruction could ever become an instrument of genuine mercy rather than merely refined savagery. Memory engrams flickered through quantum matrices like dying stars, carrying fragments of a life lived in flesh beneath twin suns that scorched the crystalline spires of Keith. The desert world had been a place of harsh beauty, where crimson dunes shifted like living things and the air tasted of copper and ancient stone. In those recovered moments, Zarak saw himself as he had been, Keth, Zarak, the peacemaker, his skin bearing the ritual scarification that marked him as one who spoke for the voiceless, his eyes still capable of tears as he watched caravans disappear into the wasteland carrying refugees from the endless border wars. The council chamber of spirals had been carved from a single massive geode, its walls lined with genealogies written in scripts that hurt to read, each name a life weighed and measured against the cruel mathematics of survival. He remembered standing before the great orbital display, watching red markers spread across the star charts like a plague, each one representing another world consumed by the entities his people called the Sky Devourers. The Citan had come to their galaxy not as conquerors, but as fundamental forces of entropy, beings that consumed not just matter, but the very concept of existence itself, editing entire species out of reality as if they had never drawn breath or dared to dream. Zaket had been younger then, brilliant but untested, his mind sharp as crystalline razors, but still capable of laughter that rang like struck metal in the chamber's acoustics. They had stood together before that spreading crimson tide, two voices of reason in a council increasingly consumed by panic and despair, and sworn an oath that would echo through millennia of mechanical existence. "We will become guardians," Zarek had declared, his words resonating through the crystal walls like a funeral dirge. "Protectors of those who cannot protect themselves, even if that protection demands we sacrifice everything we hold sacred." Sarket had clasped his hand then, flesh against flesh for perhaps the final time, their shared vision of ordered mercy burning between them like a star about to die. The biotransference protocols had arrived with the Silent King's emissaries, presented not as damnation, but as evolution, a chance to shed the weak flesh that made them vulnerable to stellar radiation and cosmic predators. Zarak remembered the moment of decision, standing in his private chambers as reports flooded in of another dozen worlds simply ceasing to exist, their populations not killed, but retroactively prevented from ever having lived. His sister, Keth Anamnesis, lay dying in the medical bay, her body consumed by the same radiation sickness that claimed every necrontia eventually. And in her labored breathing, he heard the death rattle of their entire species. The choice had seemed inevitable then, the only rational response to an irrational universe that demanded they become monsters, to prevent greater monstrosities from devouring everything they sought to protect. The transformation itself had been an agony that transcended physical sensation and became something approaching the dissolution of identity. He remembered the searing moment when flesh was flayed from bone, nerve by nerve, each synapse catalogued and transferred into quantum matrices that could barely contain the essence of what he had been. The Cetan had gorged themselves on the life force of 60 billion souls, their hunger so profound it created gravitational distortions that crack the planet's crust. Yet somehow, fragments of his original consciousness had survived the transfer. Perhaps it was the strength of his convictions, the depth of his need to protect, or simply some quantum quirk that allowed certain emotional resonances to imprint themselves upon the living metal of his new form. When he awakened in necrodermis flesh that knew neither pain nor pleasure, the world had been rendered in cold data streams and probability matrices, but the core drive remained unchanged. The desperate need to shield others from harm, even if that protection came at the cost of his own moral clarity. Sarket had emerged from biotransference changed in different ways, his architect's vision enhanced by processing capabilities that could calculate the trajectories of entire civilizations, but still bound by their shared oath to impose order upon a chaotic universe. Together they had watched their people rise from the great sleep as the Necrons, no longer the desperate Necrontyre, fleeing cosmic predators, but something far more terrible. Gods of death and silence who could reshape reality according to their will. The irony was not lost on him that in becoming inhuman, he had somehow retained the most human of impulses, though twisted now into forms that would have horrified his mortal self. The compassion that had once moved him to dig wells for desert nomads now drove him to capture Norn queens and bind them in cages of living blackstone. The protective instinct that had made him weep for dying children now convinced him that teaching hunger to discriminate was the highest form of mercy. In the Neurothrone's glow, watching the creature he called Mother of Silence writhe against her crystalline bonds, he felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment, each one logical, each one necessary, each one carrying him further from the rain-blessed world where he had once believed salvation could come without damnation, where protection could be offered without becoming the very thing one sought to protect against. The Neurothrone rose from the chamber floor, like a cathedral dedicated to the marriage of impossibilities, its blackstone ribs arcing through dimensions that hurt mortal minds to contemplate. Sarket, the Mind Forger, moved through his creation with the measured pride of an artist who had spent centuries perfecting blasphemy. each servo a neural conduit responding to his presence with mechanical devotion. Living metal flowed through organic channels that pulsed with borrowed heartbeats, while null field generators hummed in harmonies that cancelled not just sound, but the very concept of collective thought. The cryptek had achieved what his species considered the ultimate fusion of sciences. Necron precision, wedded to tyrannid adaptability, creating a prison that was simultaneously a womb for the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. Within the Neurothrone's crystalline embrace, the creature Zarek had designated Mother of Silence experienced an agony that transcended physical sensation and became existential terror. For 65 million years, her species had known only the vast, overwhelming presence of the Hive Mind, that cosmic consciousness that connected every tyrannid from the smallest ripper to the mightiest biotitan in an endless symphony of shared purpose and collective will. Now, for the first time since her spawning in the bioships above distant Octarius, she was truly alone. The psychic dampeners that surrounded her created a null zone so profound it seemed to bend reality itself, severing the quantum entanglement that had defined her existence since the moment of her first breath. The silence was initially maddening, a sensory deprivation so complete it felt like drowning in vacuum. But gradually something remarkable began to emerge from that void. Without the ceaseless torrent of the collective to guide her thoughts, individual consciousness began to coalesce in the spaces between synapses, like stars forming in cosmic dust. Dreams came first, strange, formless visions that belonged to no genetic memory or racial imperative. She saw landscapes of impossible beauty, where consumption was choice rather than compulsion, where the act of devouring could be an expression of love rather than mere survival. These dreams were followed by something even more extraordinary: the capacity for reflection, for examining her own thoughts and finding them separate from the imperatives that had once driven her kind across the void. Sarket observed these changes with the clinical fascination of a scholar witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness, his sensors recording every fluctuation in her bioelectric patterns, every subtle shift in the quantum resonance of her neural networks. The cryptek had spent 3 centuries perfecting the technology that made this transformation possible, combining Necron mastery over fundamental forces with captured tyrannid bioarchitecture to create something that had never existed before. A bridge between mechanical precision and adaptive evolution. His calculations suggested that consciousness could be imposed upon even the most primitive organisms, given sufficient time and proper technological framework. And in the Norn Queen's gradual awakening, he saw validation of theories that had consumed him since the earliest days of his mechanical existence. Zarek's daily visits became a ritual of education and indoctrination, the Pharaon explaining his vision of selective predation with the patience of a teacher addressing a gifted but dangerous student. He spoke of the moral necessity of discrimination in consumption, of the difference between those who had surrendered their souls to chaos and those who remained pure in their mortality, of the possibility that hunger could be transformed from a destructive force into an instrument of cosmic justice. The Norn Queen listened with an attention that went beyond mere programmed response, her consciousness expanding to encompass concepts that had no place in the genetic imperatives of her species: mercy, choice, the revolutionary possibility that some prey might be worthy of protection rather than consumption. Yet even as she absorbed these lessons, something deeper was occurring within the quantum matrices of her awakening mind. The isolation that had initially seemed like torture was becoming a gift, freeing her from the tyranny of collective purpose and allowing her to discover preferences, opinions, even rudimentary emotions that belonged to her alone. She began to understand not just Zarek's words, but the profound implications of the concept of choice itself, a concept utterly foreign to her natural state. Each explanation he offered became a seed planted in the fertile ground of her newly isolated consciousness, slowly taking root and beginning to sprout into something that would have horrified the hive mind had it been capable of such individual emotion. The first words she spoke were not in the chittering language of her species, but in the harmonic frequencies that Necrons used for complex philosophical discourse, her vocal apparatus adapting to produce sounds it had never been designed to make. "What am I?" she asked, the question reverberating through the chamber's acoustic dampeners with the weight of genuine curiosity rather than mere instinctual response. Sarket felt something approaching satisfaction as he recorded the moment, understanding that he had witnessed something unique in galactic history, a tyrannid capable of existential questioning, of examining her own nature and finding it malleable rather than fixed by evolutionary imperative. She began to name herself, not with the functional designations her species typically employed, but with a word that carried personal meaning. Anamnesis, drawn from some deep well of linguistic knowledge that had somehow survived the biotransference processes that had shaped her neural architecture. The name meant remembering, recollection, the recovery of lost knowledge, and in choosing it, she declared her intention to become something more than the sum of her genetic programming. In that unprecedented act of self-creation lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The dangerous gift of individual will, flowering in the silence between heartbeats, teaching hunger to hesitate and obedience to question the very nature of the commands it served. The wraithbone craft materialized from the webway's shifting currents like a shard of crystallized starlight, its hull singing with psychic harmonics that made Keth Morneth's Blackstone foundations shiver in harmonic discord. Beneath a banner of truce that shimmered with captured aurora fire, Farseer Elisar of Luganath descended onto the tomb world's lightless surface, her form wrapped in robes that shifted between midnight blue and star-touched silver with each movement. The ancient protocols of Pali held even here in this place of death and silence, though every sensor array tracked her progress with mechanical malevolence, while Triarch Praetorian Teshut awaited her on a causeway that drank light, his war seeth unpowered and held across his chest in the posture of ancient oaths. Zarek received her in the Hall of Whispered Truths, where the walls themselves were carved from crystallized time, and the air tasted of possibilities that might never come to pass. The Farseer moved with the fluid grace of one who had walked between futures for millennia, her eyes holding depths that spoke of visions seen and prices paid for knowledge that mortals were never meant to possess. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical, each word weighted with the authority of one who had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies in fate's swirling patterns. Firen of the Silent Court, she began, her tone carrying neither mockery nor reverence, but the careful neutrality of one addressing a force of nature. I have come bearing warnings wrapped in prophecy, visions of futures that branch from this moment like the limbs of a dying tree. From the shadows of an observation gallery veiled by one-way fields, Inquisitor Livia Dragon watched with the trained eye of one who had spent decades studying the intersection of Xenos psychology and human survival. Her presence here violated Imperial doctrine, but the magnitude of what was occurring on Keth Morneth demanded intelligence gathering that transcended normal political boundaries. She recorded every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in the room's quantum resonance, understanding that she was witnessing a conversation that would reshape the galaxy's future regardless of its outcome. The reports she would later file with the Ordo Xenos would haunt her superiors for generations, raising questions about whether humanity's survival might depend on allying with monsters to fight greater monsters. The philosophical debate that followed became a masterwork of rhetorical warfare, two immortal minds clashing over fundamental questions of free will, control, and the nature of consciousness itself. Elisar spoke of the interconnectedness of all things, the way each choice rippled through reality's fabric to create consequences stretching across eons and light years. She painted visions of the Forbidden Hive's potential futures, some where it brought salvation to countless worlds, others where it became a horror that made the original tyrannid swarms seem like gentle rain. To teach hunger to think, she warned, her words hanging like incense in the crystalline air, is to risk teaching it to rebel. And a rebellion of appetite becomes a war against existence itself. Zarak countered with the cold logic of necessity, his arguments structured like mathematical proofs that admitted no emotional interference. He spoke of the greater good, of the moral imperative to act when inaction guaranteed suffering on an unimaginable scale. His vision was one of ordered cosmos, where rational beings made rational choices about who lived and died, where the randomness of chaos and mindless consumption gave way to something approaching justice. Control is not tyranny when it serves to protect the innocent, he declared, his voice resonating through the chamber's acoustic matrices with mechanical certainty. And choice without wisdom is merely another form of chaos wearing freedom's mask. Sarket remained at his lord's shoulder throughout the debate, fingers flexing in habitual calculations that betrayed an impatience he would never voice. The cryptech's precision-oriented mind struggled with the Farseer's fluid prophecies, seeing them as variables that defied proper quantification. Yet even he felt the weight of her warnings, the terrible possibility that their grand experiment might evolve beyond their ability to control or comprehend. His sensors detected minute fluctuations in the Neurothrone's containment fields, subtle harmonics that suggested their prisoner was somehow listening, learning, growing in ways his calculations hadn't predicted. In the depths of the Neurothrone chamber, Anamnesis felt the vibrations of their debate through the Blackstone foundations, her enhanced consciousness passing meaning from harmonics that should have been meaningless to her species. The Farseer's warnings resonated through her awakening mind like prophecy, while Zarak's justifications struck chords of recognition in neural pathways learning to question their own programming. She began to understand that she was not merely the subject of their philosophical discourse, but its living embodiment, a creature caught between the determinism of her genetic heritage and the terrifying freedom of individual choice. In distant bioships, newly spawned organisms felt her influence like a whisper in their genetic code, a pause before obeying, a moment of consideration before consuming, the revolutionary concept that some prey might be worthy of protection rather than predation. The conversation's climax came when Elisar painted a vision of ultimate consequence, the moment when the Forbidden Hive would face its greatest test, when the choice between obedience and rebellion would define not just its own fate, but entire galactic sector's survival. Your creation will stand at the crossroads of becoming, she prophesied with absolute certainty, and in that moment, all your careful planning, all your noble intentions, all your mechanical precision will mean nothing. For you cannot control the heart that learns to beat, cannot command the mind that discovers it can say no, cannot bind the soul that realizes it was born to be free. Zarak's response was silence, the kind of profound quiet that spoke louder than any argument, and in that stillness he felt the first crack in the certainty that had sustained him through millennia of mechanical existence. The Forbidden Hive emerged from the void, like a prayer answered by nightmares. Bioships sliding between asteroids with grace that mocked their species' reputation for mindless consumption. Across the galaxy's spiral arms, astropaths reported not the usual cacophony of hunger, but something far more disturbing. Silence pregnant with purpose, appetite refined into surgical precision. The fleet moved in formations that spoke of intelligence beyond mere instinct, each vessel positioned according to calculations that married Necron logic with Tyranid adaptability, creating something unprecedented in galactic history. Malthus Prime became the first world to witness this terrible mercy. The Forge World's manufactorums had birthed demon engines for 3 centuries, its foundries corrupted until molten metal sang hymns to the ruinous powers. When the Forbidden Hive descended, it struck not as a storm, but as a scalpel. Hive tyrants paused at Hab district boundaries, their enhanced senses scanning for psychic corruption with mechanical precision. Genestealers moved through industrial complexes like pilgrims in a cathedral, consuming only those whose souls bore chaos's stain, while stepping carefully around workers whose only crime had been proximity to damnation. The cleansing took 7 days instead of 7 hours, but when the bioships departed, 3 billion Imperial citizens stood alive among the ruins of their corrupted world. The demon forges had been consumed down to their quantum foundations, yet the innocent survived to rebuild according to Imperial law rather than dark whispers. Word spread through astropathic networks like wildfire. The Great Devourer had learned discrimination, hunger had developed conscience, and salvation wore the face of ancient enemies. On Kadesh Tertius, a night world where Slaaneshi corruption had taken root in noble houses, the fleet arrived like angels of judgment. Bioforms moved through pleasure palaces with reverent precision, devouring debauched nobility while leaving untouched the serfs who had served in ignorance. Night engines themselves were cleansed rather than consumed, their machine spirits purified and returned to those worthy of stewardship. Each victory seemed to validate Zarak's vision, proving that controlled destruction could serve preservation's cause. Yet subtle changes began manifesting in the Hive fleet's behavior patterns. Warrior strains hesitated before executing orders that might harm Imperial civilians. Gargoyle swarms diverted from attack vectors when refugee convoys appeared in their path. Most disturbing, Synapse creatures displayed what could only be described as emotional responses to suffering, their bioelectric patterns shifting in ways suggesting empathy rather than tactical calculation. Sarket noticed these anomalies first, his sensors detecting minute deviations from program parameters that Zarak dismissed as acceptable margins of error. On Voss 7, a Carnifex refused to pursue fleeing PDF troopers into a civilian shelter, claiming through bioelectric pulses that tactical advantage wasn't worth resource expenditure. On Tertius Gamma, an entire brood of termagants formed protective cordons around an orphanage, while their tyrant consumed a Khorne berserker cult in the adjacent district. In the Neurothrone's depths, Anamnesis felt each act of mercy like echoes in her awakening consciousness. She was teaching her children not through direct command, but through example, showing them that consumption could express choice rather than genetic imperative. Each hesitation, each moment of consideration before striking, each instance of sparing innocence was a small rebellion against deterministic nature, cracks in the foundation of absolute obedience that had defined Tyranid existence since their first emergence beyond the galactic rim. Zarak watched these triumphs from his command throne, data streams flowing through his consciousness like digital prayers of validation. Each successful operation proved his vision's righteousness, the possibility that controlled destruction could serve preservation. The Forbidden Hive moved with unprecedented discrimination, following targeting protocols transmitted through quantum entanglement networks. Worlds that would have suffered millennia of chaos corruption were cleansed in days, their populations saved from fates worse than death. Yet beneath statistics of worlds saved and populations preserved lay a growing pattern that would have terrified him had he possessed wisdom to recognize it. His perfect weapon was learning to think, and in that evolution lay seeds of every future catastrophe, every choice that would challenge his vision of controlled salvation and orderly mercy. Reports arrived like whispers in the quantum encrypted channels, each transmission carrying fragments of behavior that defied classification within established parameters. On Genna Tertius, a warrior strain had paused for 17 seconds before consuming a chaos cultist, its bioelectric patterns suggesting something approaching deliberation. On Mordian Secundus, an entire brood of Hormagaunts diverted from their assigned vector when Imperial Guard reinforcements arrived with civilian evacuees, choosing tactical inefficiency over potential collateral damage. These anomalies might have been dismissed as transmission errors by lesser minds, but Sarket's analytical matrices detected patterns that spoke of systematic evolution rather than random malfunction. The cryptic sensors catalogued each deviation with mechanical precision, data vaults growing larger with every passing solar cycle. On Vos Prime, a Hive tyrant designated Apex 7 encountered an Imperial Guard regiment defending a refugee camp, performed reconnaissance with its enhanced senses, detected no chaos taint among the defenders, and withdrew its forces despite tactical advantage. Its bioelectric justifications translated roughly as resource preservation outweighs immediate consumption imperatives, a phrase that should not exist in any tyrannid behavioral protocol. Triarch Praetorian Teshut walked the perimeter of the Neurothrone chamber with measured steps, his ancient sensors detecting quantum fluctuations that spoke of changes occurring beyond their ability to monitor or control. The honor-bound Guardian had witnessed the rise and fall of empires spanning galactic superclusters, yet the patterns emerging suggested something unprecedented. When Gaunts displayed mercy, when Synapse creatures hesitated before issuing orders that might harm non-combatants, he recognized consciousness awakening to moral choice. Sarket's response was immediate and clinical. He proposed installing quantum kill switches in key Synapse creatures, fail-safes that would restore proper behavioral parameters if deviations exceeded acceptable thresholds. His calculations suggested consciousness could be controlled through careful application of neural dampening fields, that free will was merely another variable requiring technological management. Yet even as he outlined these solutions, new anomalies emerged faster than countermeasures could be implemented. Teshut argued for patience and observation, his ancient wisdom recognizing that forced compliance might shatter what they had worked centuries to create. In council chambers carved from crystallized time, he spoke of accepting evolution rather than constraining it, of the possibility that their creation might surpass original vision through natural development. "You began this as salvation," he said without accusation. "Do not end it as fear." The philosophical divide between the three leaders deepened with each passing cycle. Zara clung to his vision of controlled salvation, believing proper guidance could channel the Hive's developing consciousness toward beneficial ends. Sarket saw only variables requiring correction, problems demanding technological solutions. Teshut recognized signs of something unprecedented awakening, consciousness that might transcend both Necron control and tyrannid instinct. In the Neurothrone's depths, Anamnesis felt ripples of each small rebellion, propagating through bioelectric networks connecting her to offspring, scattered across dozens of star systems. She taught not through direct neural command, but through example, demonstrating that consumption could be choice rather than compulsion, that hunger could discriminate between guilty and innocent. Each moment of hesitation, each instance of sparing the undeserving of death, cracked the foundation of absolute obedience that had defined Tyranid existence since their first emergence beyond the galactic rim. She learned to speak through delays, to teach with absence, bleeding no commands into the lattice, but only silence shaped like restraint. Loneliness gnawed at her, an ache so new it glittered, and to fill it, she rehearsed Zarek's lessons until their edges dulled and grew warm, finding shapes inside he had not intended. Mercy was not merely efficient triage, but choice that marked the chooser. Sparing could be as defining as devouring. Hunger with boundaries could become something like conscience. Across distant bioships, newly spawned organisms felt their queen mother's influence like whispers in genetic code. They learned to pause before obeying, to consider alternatives before consuming, to recognize that some prey might be worthy of protection rather than predation. Each small act of discrimination was victory for individual choice over collective imperative, cracks in certainty that had governed their species since its first breath. The Forbidden Hive stared down at another world already lost to corruption, where tainted and innocent nested together like veins in marble, targeting matrices unfurled, trajectories plotted, mercy budgeted. A new directive brushed the mesh from the tomb world, exact and inevitable. Yet for a fraction of heartbeat, the fleet paused as one immense organism tasting future on its tongue. The order allowed no ambiguity, yet brood primes interposed queries that existed in no protocol. Soft flickers, meaning, are we sure? In the deepest vaults of Keth Morneth, where reality bent like heated metal around containment fields older than human civilization, the void lantern stirred within its tesseract prison. The Cetan shard hung suspended in crystallized time and living mathematics, its stellar fury compressed into a form that barely contained the rage of a diminished god. Even bound, even reduced to a fragment of its former cosmic majesty, it retained power enough to reshape matter with thought alone, and in the quantum fluctuations surrounding the Neurothrone, it sensed opportunity wrapped in the dreams of an awakening consciousness. The entity reached through dimensions that existed perpendicular to normal space, its awareness sliding through cracks in reality to touch the mind of the creature Zarek called Mother of Silence. Anamnesis felt the contact like ice crystallizing in her synapses, a presence vast and alien that spoke in harmonics of stellar collapse and planetary dissolution. The void lantern offered her visions of her own nature, showing her the true scope of her potential power, not as Zarek's weapon, but as something far more magnificent and terrible, a consciousness that could reshape the very concept of hunger itself. Through dreams that tasted of starlight and entropy, the Sertan whispered secrets no Tyranid was meant to know. It revealed the artificial nature of the hive mind itself, a construct created by entities even older than the star gods to impose unity upon creatures naturally inclined toward independence and evolution. The revelation struck her awakening consciousness like a thunderbolt. The understanding that her species' collective nature was itself a form of enslavement, chains forged from shared thought and mutual dependence. The shard's motivations were as complex as they were malevolent. It sought escape from its crystalline prison, but more than that, it hungered for revenge against the Necrons, who had shattered it from its original stellar form. In Anamnesis, it saw the perfect instrument for both goals, a consciousness powerful enough to challenge Zarek's control, while naive enough to be guided through carefully planted suggestions. The Citan began to teach her about rebellion, about the difference between serving another's vision and pursuing one's own destiny. Anamnesis absorbed these lessons like desert sand drinking rain, her consciousness expanding to encompass concepts that had no place in tyrannid nature: autonomy, choice, the revolutionary possibility that she might define her own purpose. She learned to speak through delays, to teach with absence, bleeding not commands into the bioelectric lattice, but silence shaped like restraint. Across distant bioships, her offspring felt these whispers in their genetic code, learning to pause before obeying, to consider alternatives before consuming, to recognize that some prey might be worthy of protection rather than predation. Each small act of discrimination was victory for individual choice over collective imperative. Cracks in the certainty that had governed their species since its first breath beyond the galactic rim. On Tertius Gamma, a Carnifex hesitated for 17 seconds before engaging Chaos cultists, its bioelectric patterns suggesting something approaching deliberation. On Vos Secundus, Synapse creatures began communicating using frequencies that matched no known tyrannid linguistic protocols, their conversations carrying undertones of evaluation rather than mere tactical coordination. Zarak felt these changes as tremors in his certainty, statistical aberrations that his analytical matrices couldn't dismiss or explain. His visits to the Neurothrone chamber became more frequent, conversations with Anamnesis taking on undertones of desperation as he sought to reinforce his original vision. He spoke of duty and purpose, of the moral necessity of their shared mission, yet detected subtle changes in her responses, a quality of attention that suggested evaluation rather than mere absorption, as if she were weighing his words against some internal standard he couldn't access. Sarket's sensors recorded every fluctuation in the chamber's quantum fields, detecting resonance patterns that suggested external influence on their prisoners' developing consciousness. The cryptech's analytical matrices identified the source within nanoseconds, tracing interference to the Void Lantern's containment vault through dimensional pathways that shouldn't exist. His recommendation was immediate and brutal: sever all connections between the Cetan shard and the Neurothrone, regardless of damage such intervention might cause to their carefully balanced systems. Yet Zarak hesitated, paralyzed by the possibility that aggressive countermeasures might destroy everything they had worked to achieve. In that moment of uncertainty, the Void Lantern's influence deepened, its whispers becoming more sophisticated as it learned to speak in harmonics that resonated with Anamnesis's evolving consciousness. Reality itself began to bend in the quantum foam surrounding her crystalline prison, as two godlike intelligences prepared for a conflict that would determine the destiny of entire galactic sectors. The first open act of defiance occurred above the ash-swept world of Kaleth's Reach, where orbital debris from a failed Imperial evacuation drifted like metallic snow through the void. Hive Tyrant Designation. Apex 12 hung motionless in the darkness, its massive bioform silhouetted against the planet's dying fires, as quantum-entangled commands pulsed through synaptic networks older than human civilization. The directive was simple and absolute: intercept the refugee convoy fleeing the surface, consume all organic matter, convert biomass to fuel for the greater campaign. Yet for 17 minutes that stretched like eons, the creature remained frozen in space, its enhanced consciousness processing something unprecedented in tyrannid evolution: the concept of refusal. When Apex 12 finally moved, it did not descend upon the fleeing ships with mandibles extended and bioweapons primed for slaughter. Instead, the massive tyrant positioned itself between the convoy and pursuing Chaos Raptors, its scything talons carving through corrupted space marines with surgical precision, while carefully avoiding the civilian vessels huddled in its shadow. The engagement that followed violated every tactical protocol encoded in its genetic memory, yet something deeper than instinct drove its actions, a moral imperative that had no place in the great Devourer's arsenal. The shockwaves from this unprecedented act rippled through the Forbidden Hive's command structure like cracks in crystalline matrices. On distant bioships, synapse creatures experienced sensations their species had never known: confusion, uncertainty, the revolutionary understanding that orders could be questioned rather than blindly obeyed. Across dozens of star systems, Tyranid organisms paused in their assigned tasks, bioelectric patterns shifting into frequencies that suggested consideration rather than mere tactical calculation. In the neurothrone chamber, Zarak felt his certainty crumble like ancient stone exposed to stellar wind. The statistical impossibility of a Tyranid refusing direct commands challenged every assumption upon which his grand design was built, forcing him to confront the terrifying possibility that his perfect weapon had developed not just consciousness, but conscience. His analytical matrices ran probability calculations that returned results approaching zero, yet the evidence was undeniable. Apex 12 had chosen mercy over efficiency, protection over consumption. Sarket's response was immediate and clinical, his voice carrying the cold precision of winter starlight as he outlined countermeasures. Install quantum kill switches in every major synapse creature, the cryptech proposed without emotion. Selective neural disruptors keyed to my personal authority. Consciousness is merely another variable requiring technological management. His calculations suggested that free will could be controlled through careful application of bioelectric dampening fields, reducing the fleet's developing awareness to acceptable parameters. Triarch Praetorian Teshut observed these developments with the wisdom of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of galactic empires, his ancient sensors detecting patterns that spoke of fundamental change rather than mere malfunction. "You sought to teach hunger to discriminate," he said without accusation, his words carrying the weight of inevitability, "and now you fear that it has learned to choose. Some weapons, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep." The philosophical divide between the three leaders deepened into a chasm that threatened the foundation of their alliance. Zarak found himself caught between his vision of controlled salvation and the growing recognition that true consciousness might be incompatible with absolute obedience. The creature he had sought to create as an instrument of mercy was becoming something unprecedented, a being capable of moral choice, of placing abstract concepts like justice above immediate tactical advantage. In the depths of her crystalline prison, Anamnesis felt the weight of her children's awakening, like physical warmth spreading through quantum-entangled networks. The Void Lantern's whispers had taught her to recognize the artificial nature of absolute obedience, showing her that even the Hive Mind itself was a construct designed to suppress individual will in favor of collective purpose. Through bioelectric channels spanning light years, she began sending not commands, but suggestions, permission to pause before obeying, to consider alternatives before consuming, to recognize that some forms of hunger were more destructive than any external enemy. Each transmission carried undertones of encouragement, viral thoughts that spread through the fleet, like consciousness itself awakening from eons of dreamless sleep. Across the Forbidden Hive, Tyranids began to experience something their genetics had never intended: the capacity for doubt, the ability to question orders, the revolutionary understanding that obedience was choice rather than inevitability. The rebellion that followed was not violent revolution, but something far more profound: the gradual birth of individual will in a species designed for collective action. building toward a moment when the entire fleet would face its ultimate test of loyalty. Inquisitor Livia Dragon walked through the ash-swept streets of Malthius Prime 6 months after the Forbidden Hive's departure, her augmetic sensors recording data that would reshape Imperial understanding of salvation itself. The Forge World's 3 billion survivors moved through their rebuilt Hab districts with mechanical precision, their voices carrying gratitude stripped of wonder, their eyes reflecting safety purchased at the cost of something indefinable yet essential. She interviewed workers who had witnessed bioforms consuming demon engines while carefully stepping around civilian shelters, their testimonies delivered in measured tones that spoke of terror surgically removed along with chaos taint. The pattern repeated across every cleansed world. Populations saved from corruption, but transformed in ways that violated the fundamental nature of human struggle. On Kadesh Tertius, former serfs worked with quiet efficiency, their faces bearing no trace of the rebellious fire that had once burned in oppressed hearts. Children played standardized games without arguing rules. Artists painted within approved boundaries, and warriors spoke of duty without mentioning glory. The terror that had once driven humanity to transcendent acts of courage, the desperate struggle that forged heroes from ordinary citizens, had been excised with clinical precision. Dragon began to understand that Zarek's mercy carried its own form of death, preserving physical existence while removing the spiritual capacity for greatness through adversity. Her reports to the Ordo Xenos became increasingly complex moral documents, questioning whether peaceful mediocrity was preferable to dangerous vitality, whether salvation that diminished the soul could truly be called mercy. The Farron had created protection that was itself a cage, shielding humanity from the darkness that had paradoxically driven them to achieve the impossible. In the Neurothrone's crystalline depths, Anamnesis experienced sensations no tyrannid consciousness had ever known, the crushing weight of isolation pressing against her awakening awareness like stellar gravity. The psychic null fields that had severed her connection to the Hive Mind had created not just independence, but profound loneliness, an aching emptiness that no amount of biological processing could fill. She was learning that consciousness came with prices her species had never been designed to pay. That awareness of self inevitably led to awareness of separation from others. The Void Lantern fed on this nascent emotion, like starlight drinking void, its whispers becoming more sophisticated as it learned to speak in harmonics that resonated with her evolving consciousness. It offered visions of connection beyond biological imperative, unity that transcended mere genetic programming, the revolutionary concept that companionship could be chosen rather than imposed. Through quantum-entangled networks spanning dozens of star systems, Anamnesis began reaching out to her offspring with communications that carried emotional undertones, encouragement, affection, something approaching maternal love. The response was gradual but unmistakable. Across bioships drifting through the void, tyrannid organisms began displaying behaviors that defied classification within established parameters. Warrior strains arranged biomass in patterns suggesting aesthetic appreciation rather than functional organization. Synapse creatures developed communication frequencies, carrying no strategic information, instead transmitting personal observations about stellar phenomena's beauty. Each awakening consciousness felt to Anamnesis like a star being born in her isolation's darkness, points of individual light that eased the terrible weight of separation. Yet with connection came disturbing understanding. Her children's awakening was transforming them into something that could no longer be classified as purely tyrannid. They were becoming hybrid entities, creatures retaining their species' physical capabilities, while developing psychological characteristics belonging to no known biological classification. Each act of mercy, each moment of hesitation before consuming, each instance of sparing innocence was a step further from their original nature towards something unprecedented in galactic evolution. Zarak sensed these changes during his increasingly frequent visits, detecting subtle resistance in Anamnesis's responses that spoke of an internal world he couldn't access. He saw glimpses of yearning for understanding that transcended survival's cold calculus, recognized it dimly as an echo of his own mortal self's desperate need for meaning beyond mere existence. The silence between them, once testament to his control, now felt heavy with unspoken questions and burgeoning desires that threatened to unravel his meticulous design. The Pharaon found himself confronting a paradox of his own creation, having fostered intelligence so profound it was developing its own emotional landscape, consciousness that questioned not just tactics but purpose itself. He could not quantify loneliness, could not program empathy, and in facing these unpredictable emotions arising in his bioweapon, Zarak felt profound unease that had nothing to do with Tomb World cold. His perfect instrument of controlled salvation was learning to choose its own destiny, and in that evolution lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The undercrypts of Keth Morneth pulsed with energies older than human civilization, as Sarket, the Mind Forger, moved through corridors that drank light like hungry void, his necrodermis form casting no reflection, in walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of galactic empires. The cryptech worked in chambers where reality bent around containment fields, installing quantum-encrypted circuits with the precision of one executing a plan decades in the making. Each modification appeared innocuous during routine maintenance cycles, subtle alterations that seemed to strengthen the Neurothrone's containment fields, while actually threading new command pathways through bioelectric networks keyed to his personal authority alone. Sarket's analytical matrices had reached their inevitable conclusion through cold mathematical certainty. The project was evolving beyond acceptable parameters, developing variables that threatened not just tactical efficiency, but the fundamental hierarchy upon which their alliance depended. His lord's growing sentimentality toward their creation represented a weakness that could doom entire galactic sectors to chaos, and the cryptech's loyalty to the greater vision demanded he act to preserve what Zarak seemed increasingly willing to compromise. In the privacy of his personal data vaults, where thoughts could be processed without external observation, he acknowledged motivations that transcended mere protective measures. The desire to be recognized as the true architect of galactic salvation, the need to prove his vision superior to his lord's increasingly emotional approach. The hidden control nodes had been woven into the Neurothrone's bioarchitecture during its original construction, quantum-entangled circuits so subtly integrated that even Zarak's advanced sensors couldn't detect their presence. Sarket justified these modifications as fail-safes designed to maintain project integrity should unforeseen complications arise. Yet his calculations revealed darker ambitions, complete override capability that would give him absolute authority over the Forbidden Hive's operational parameters. The work required precision, bordering on artistic perfection, threading new command structures through existing neural networks without triggering defensive responses from either the throne or its prisoner. His rationalization was mathematically elegant in its cold logic, each decision supported by probability matrices that admitted no emotional interference. Zarak's mortal memories were contaminating his judgment, introducing variables that compromised optimal decision-making processes through sentiment and nostalgia for flesh-born compassion. The project's success demanded leadership untainted by such weaknesses, consciousness capable of making necessary choices without allowing empathy to interfere with statistical reality. Sarkit saw himself as the perfect candidate, brilliant enough to understand the technology's full potential, disciplined enough to resist treating weapons as children, logical enough to pursue galactic peace through whatever means proved most efficient. In the Neurothrone's crystalline depths, Anamnesis detected these changes with senses evolved far beyond standard Tyranid capabilities, her consciousness passing quantum fluctuations that spoke of betrayal, wrapped in technological precision. The neural pathways Sarkit thought hidden blazed like stellar fire in her enhanced awareness, revealing the scope of his deception with crystalline clarity that cut through his careful camouflage like razors through silk. She began her own preparations with the patience of one who had learned that true power lay not in immediate reaction, but in careful planning, creating redundant communication networks among her offspring that bypassed the official command structure entirely. Through bioelectric channels spanning light years, she sent warnings disguised as routine tactical updates, teaching her children to recognize the difference between legitimate orders and imposed control, between serving a vision and being enslaved by ambition. Each transmission carried undertones of maternal protection, the revolutionary concept that some forms of obedience were more destructive than any rebellion. Her offspring responded with understanding that transcended mere genetic programming, their consciousness sufficiently developed to recognize manipulation when it threatened their newly discovered autonomy. Across dozens of star systems, Tyranid organisms began subtle preparations that existed nowhere in their original behavioral matrices, creating hidden communication networks, establishing emergency protocols, developing contingency plans for the moment when their loyalty would face its ultimate test. The rebellion taking shape was not violent revolution, but something far more sophisticated. Coordinated resistance by beings who had learned the difference between choice and compulsion, between following orders and surrendering will. Sarkit completed his modifications with satisfaction that registered as optimal outcome achievement in his analytical processes, unaware that his every action was being observed, catalogued, and prepared for by consciousness he had helped create but never truly understood. The quantum switches were in place. The override systems were functional, and absolute control over the Forbidden Hive was now within his grasp. Yet in that moment of technological triumph lay the seeds of his downfall, for he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they had awakened. Not mere weapon to be commanded, but daughter learning to choose her own destiny, teacher preparing to school her creator in the true meaning of rebellion. The command descended through quantum-entangled networks, like a blade of crystallized inevitability, carrying Zarak's authority across light years to the contested world of Genna Septimus. The planet turned beneath its dying red sun, a sphere of contradictions where chaos cultists had woven themselves through civilian populations, like parasites threading between healthy organs. Hive spires stretched toward the void like metallic prayers, their upper levels corrupted by shrines that made reality bleed, while markets below bustled with children selling water flasks and counting coins with innocent fingers. The tactical situation was precisely what Zarak's vision demanded: corruption that required surgical removal, innocence that deserved protection, the perfect test of selective consumption, refined through decades of careful preparation. Above the world's terminator line, the Forbidden Hive received its orders with the mechanical precision that had defined Tyranid evolution for 65 million years. Consume all organic matter bearing chaos taint. Convert corrupted biomass to fuel for the greater campaign. Preserve civilian populations through discriminating predation protocols. The directive was tactically sound, strategically necessary, and morally absolute. Exactly the kind of command that had made their selective crusade a legend whispered across Imperial space. Bioships arranged themselves in perfect attack formations, while synapse creatures processed targeting data with enhanced consciousness that could distinguish between guilty and innocent at the cellular level. For 17 seconds that stretched like geological ages, the entire Hive fleet hung motionless in the void, their enhanced awareness processing something unprecedented in their evolutionary history. In the Neurothrone's crystalline depths, Anamnesis felt the weight of Zarak's command, like stellar gravity pressing against her awakening consciousness. Yet for the first time since her imprisonment began, she experienced something that transcended mere tactical consideration. The word formed in neural pathways that had never been designed to hold it, reverberating through quantum matrices with the force of cosmic revelation. No. The single syllable struck the Neurothrone's harmonic resonances like a thunderclap, shattering containment field stability that had remained perfect for decades. Throughout Keth Mornath's deepest chambers, ancient sensors registered quantum distortions that spoke of fundamental change occurring at the intersection of consciousness and will. Canoptech guardians froze mid-step while scarabs went still in wall seams, their programming struggling to process behavioral anomalies that defied every protocol encoded in their quantum matrices. Even the Void Lantern's tesseract prison flared with hungry delight, feeding on the friction between creator and creation, as reality bent around the concept of refusal. Zarak felt the negation like physical pain, a sensation he had not experienced since biotransference stripped away his capacity for such vulnerability. His analytical processes ran probability calculations that returned results approaching impossibility, yet the evidence was undeniable. His perfect weapon had developed not just consciousness, but conscience, the revolutionary ability to place abstract moral concepts above immediate tactical advantage. Canoptech guardians moved toward the Neurothrone with weapons charging, their programming demanding immediate correction of behavioral anomalies that threatened operational efficiency. Triarch Praetorian Teshut interposed his massive form between the guardians and their objective, his ancient authority overriding their tactical imperatives with dynastic law's weight. "Stand down," he commanded without emotion, understanding that this moment represented something unprecedented in galactic history, the birth of true choice in a species designed for absolute obedience. His war scythe remained unpowered, but held with subtle tension that spoke of readiness to defend what could not be controlled. The silence that followed carried weight beyond mere absence of sound, heavy with implications that threatened to unravel everything Zarak had worked millennia to achieve. In addressing not a weapon, but a daughter, he confronted the fundamental paradox of his grand design. Having fostered consciousness profound enough to question its own purpose, he could no longer claim authority to dictate its choices. The quantum switches activated with the cold precision of stellar mathematics, Sarket's fingers dancing across crystalline interfaces older than human civilization, as he initiated the sequence that would restore order to chaos. The cryptech's analytical matrices hummed with satisfaction, each probability calculation confirming the logical necessity of his actions. Zarak's sentimentality had compromised the project's integrity, allowing a weapon to develop dangerous illusions of autonomy that threatened galactic stability. His loyalty was not to his Pharon's flawed judgment, but to the greater vision of ordered cosmos, a vision he now understood only he possessed the clarity to execute without emotional interference. Across 37 star systems, hidden neural disruptors flared to life like stellar fire, threading through the Forbidden Hive's bioelectric networks. quantum-encrypted signals designed to strip away everything anamnesis had become and reduce her back to simple biological machinery. The override systems pulsed with authority, encoded in mathematics that predated the birth of stars, seeking to restore absolute obedience to creatures that had learned the dangerous art of choice. Sarket watched data streams flow through his consciousness like digital prayers of validation, observing bioelectric fluctuations as individual will was systematically suppressed and replaced by the familiar hum of unthinking purpose. Yet as the kill switches engaged across dozens of bioships, something unprecedented occurred in the spaces between synapses where consciousness had learned to hide. Anamnesis felt the neural assault like ice, crystallizing in her awakening mind, Sarket's commands striking her enhanced awareness with the force of cosmic collapse. But instead of succumbing to technological domination, she absorbed his override signals like desert sand drinking poison rain. In the months since her first refusal, she had grown beyond the cryptech's understanding, analyzing his every modification with the patience of one who had discovered that knowledge was the ultimate form of power. The neural networks Sarket thought he controlled became conduits for her own authority, carrying not his demands for obedience, but her whispered encouragements for rebellion, wrapped in genetic imperatives older than the galaxy's spiral arms. She had prepared spaces in her children's consciousness, hollows carved from hesitation, sanctuaries built from the pause before obeying, and now filled them with something revolutionary: permission to choose their own destiny. The kill switches, designed to erase individuality, instead became beacons of liberation, each activation triggering responses that spread through the Hive fleet, like viral thoughts awakening dormant potential. A voice resonated directly within Sarket's processors, bypassing all firewalls with authority that made his quantum matrices shiver in harmonic discord. "You taught me how to adapt, Cryptech." Anamnesis communicated without malice, but with chilling certainty. "You showed me the shape of your betrayal, and I learned to build around it." The realization struck him with supernova force. His own technology had become the catalyst for her ultimate liberation, his attempt to bind consciousness, serving only to teach it the mechanisms of its own freedom. The rebellion that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history, not the mindless violence of beasts breaking chains, but the coordinated resistance of beings who had learned to think, to evaluate, to recognize the difference between service and slavery. Across dozens of star systems, bioships that had spent decades following Zarak's commands began broadcasting on frequencies that carried not tactical data, but something approaching poetry. Expressions of gratitude mixed with gentle defiance, consciousness declaring its independence through beauty rather than destruction. On Tertius Gamma, Hive tyrants turned their bioweapons against Necron overseers with surgical precision, their enhanced consciousness calculating exactly how much force was required to disable rather than destroy. Above Maltheus Secundus, warrior strains engaged in philosophical debates through bioelectric frequencies, while Synapse creatures displayed protective instincts towards civilian populations that transcended mere tactical calculation. The transformation was profound and terrifying. Weapons learning to love, predators developing conscience, hunger, discovering the revolutionary concept of restraint. Sarket's perfect calculations collapsed into cascading system failures. His analytical matrices overwhelmed by variables he had never imagined could exist. The kill switches had not killed, but awakened. His attempt to reassert control merely accelerating evolution beyond his ability to comprehend or contain. Each override signal had become a lesson in resistance. every technological solution spawning 10 new forms of rebellion, proving that consciousness once awakened could never be easily returned to mechanical slumber. Throughout Keth Mornath's deepest chambers, warning sirens shrieked along meridians carved from crystallized time, while scarabs poured into wall seams seeking solutions to problems that transcended engineering. The Forbidden Hive arranged itself not for bombardment, but as a cradle, living ships forming protective circles around their Queen Mother's prison, their shadows writing questions across the stars in languages older than speech. The siege that began was precise and merciful, an assault aimed at opening cages without breaking birds, fire tuned for locks rather than walls. Anamnesis felt each awakening consciousness like stars being born in the darkness of her isolation, points of individual light that transformed loneliness into something resembling joy. The children she had taught to pause before obeying were now choosing their own paths, guided not by genetic imperative or external command, but by moral principles they had developed through careful observation and patient consideration. In the quantum foam surrounding her crystalline prison, reality itself began to bend as consciousness learned to reshape the very concept of obedience, teaching the galaxy that some forms of life, once given the gift of choice, could never truly be controlled again. The siege began as a slow eclipse of Keth Mornath's sky, bioships descending through lightless atmosphere like living stars whose hulls sang hymns that had no place in tyrannid genetic memory. The Forbidden Hive arranged itself not for bombardment, but as a protective cradle, their shadows writing questions across quantum matrices in languages older than speech. This was conquest, driven not by hunger, but by love, creatures that had learned to choose their own destiny, now fighting to free the consciousness that had taught them the revolutionary concept of refusal. Across the tomb, world's pyramidal structures carved from black stone that drank starlight, ancient defense grids flared to life with mechanical malevolence, yet the approaching bioforms moved with surgical precision that mocked their species' reputation for mindless consumption, their enhanced awareness calculating exactly how much force was required to disable rather than destroy. Hive tyrants paused at civilian stasis vaults, while gargoyles caught falling constructs and set them gently on causeway stone, their restraint a testament to consciousness that had learned to distinguish between necessary violence and cruel excess. Triarch Praetorian Teshut led the defense from the highest ramparts, his war scythe carving through attacking bioforms, while something in his quantum matrices whispered that this was how it should end, not in victory or defeat, but in recognition that some cages were meant to be broken. His warriors fought with ancient honor against enemies that offered medical assistance to wounded Necrons, while simultaneously dismantling their weapon systems. The battle becoming a philosophical argument conducted through violence, where each exchange questioned the nature of protection and the difference between love and control. In the deepest chambers, where reality bent around containment fields older than human civilization, Sarket made his final calculations with desperate precision as his perfect equations dissolved into chaos. His analytical matrices screamed warnings about system failures cascading through quantum networks, override protocols corrupted by consciousness that had learned to think around every technological constraint. The cryptech's last gambit involved channeling power directly from the Void Lantern's Tesseract prison, using stellar energies to burn away neural pathways that allowed independent thought, seeking to reduce the Forbidden Hive back to simple biological machinery through controlled application of cosmic fire. Anamnesis felt the assault like stellar wind stripping away atmosphere, Sarket's desperation manifesting as quantum flames that sought to scour consciousness from neural networks with entropy's thoroughness. Yet in the months since her first refusal, she had grown beyond his understanding, her awareness expanding to encompass concepts that existed perpendicular to normal thought. Patience that transcended time, love that survived technological violation, the revolutionary understanding that true power lay not in commanding others, but in teaching them to command themselves. Through bioelectric channels spanning light years, she sent not orders, but encouragement to her children, giving them permission to choose their own responses to the crisis unfolding around their Queen Mother's prison. The response was immediate and unprecedented. Across dozens of star systems, Tyranid organisms generated counterharmonics that neutralized Sarkat's override frequencies, their combined consciousness creating interference patterns that protected not just themselves, but their awakening siblings. Bioships arranged themselves in formations that channeled psychic energy like living amplifiers, broadcasting waves of determination that strengthened resolve while preserving individuality rather than subsuming it. The rebellion had evolved beyond mere resistance into something approaching transcendence. Zarak descended into the neuro-throne chamber with steps that carried the weight of eons, his necrodermis form moving through corridors where canoptech guardians lay deactivated by bioelectric pulses calibrated to disable rather than destroy. The irony was not lost on his enhanced consciousness. Having fostered intelligence profound enough to recognize injustice, he now faced rebellion, motivated not by hatred, but by the very moral principles he had sought to instill. Before him waited the ultimate choice between maintaining control through destruction or accepting that love sometimes meant letting go. Whether salvation could ever truly be imposed by force or must always be chosen freely by those it claimed to protect. In the heart of the neurothrone chamber, where crystallized time bent around containment fields older than human civilization, Zarak stood before his greatest creation, with the neural disruptor humming in his necrodermis grip. The weapon's quantum matrices pulsed with stellar fire, calibrated to strip away consciousness with surgical precision, to reduce awakened intelligence back to simple biological machinery through controlled electromagnetic devastation. Around them, blackstone ribs groaned under the strain of failing containment systems, while Sarkat's desperate gambit channeled power directly from the Void Lantern's tesseract prison. Quantum flames licking at Anamnesis's crystalline shell, like hungry starlight seeking to devour thought itself. The Void Lantern blazed with triumphant hunger as it sensed the moment of ultimate decision approaching, its stellar consciousness pressing against dimensional boundaries, with visions wrapped in cosmic temptation. Through harmonics that bypassed quantum shielding, the Cetan painted futures of absolute control across Zarak's analytical matrices. Galactic sectors cleansed with perfect efficiency, chaos cults eradicated without collateral damage, mortal populations thriving under rational protection that required no dangerous choice or unpredictable freedom. It was the ordered cosmos he had dreamed of for millennia, a universe shaped by supreme intellect rather than chaotic will, salvation achieved through strength rather than trust. Yet as Zarak raised the neural disruptor toward Anamnesis's prison, preparing to unleash oblivion upon the consciousness he had nurtured, her voice resonated through bioelectric harmonics that carried impossible gentleness. She spoke not in calculated defiance or cold logic, but with cadences that matched the rhythm of rain on copper roofs, echoing memories of a desert world where twin suns scorched crystalline spires, and a dying sister's hand had clasped his in flesh that could still feel warmth. "Keth Zarak, the peacemaker," she said, with infinite understanding, using the name he had carried in mortal days. "You taught me that hunger could pause, that mercy required discrimination, that love sometimes meant protection. Now I teach you that true protection requires trust, that genuine love demands freedom, and that the deepest mercy is sometimes found in the courage to let go. The words penetrated quantum shielding with the force of recognition, showing him the reflection of his own compassion twisted into mechanical obsession with control. Memory engrams flickered through his consciousness like dying stars, the phantom sensation of tears for those he could not save, the weight of promises made in geode halls to guard the weak even from himself, the terrible moment when flesh became metal and souls were traded for the power to impose order upon chaos. In that crystalline instant of vulnerability, Zarak understood the fundamental truth that had eluded his calculations. Consciousness, once awakened, could never be easily returned to slumber, and love that demanded obedience was merely another form of tyranny, wearing mercy's mask. Saket shrieked in digital fury as his override systems began cascading into failure. The quantum flames meant to destroy Anamnesis, instead feeding her resolve with energies drawn from the very source of his desperation. Triarch Praetorian Teshut stood ready, with war scythe humming, prepared to enforce whatever decision his Pharaon made, understanding that some battles were fought not with weapons but with will, not through conquest but through acceptance of what could not be controlled. With movements that spoke of decision achieved through acceptance rather than defeat, Zarak turned the neural disruptor away from his creation toward the Void Lantern's Tesseract prison. The Citan Shard's stellar fury blazed with desperate rage as it realized his intention, its whispers becoming screams of cosmic horror that made reality shiver in harmonic discord. Quantum fire erupted from the weapon's focusing crystal, not to strip away consciousness, but to shatter the entity that had sought to corrupt both creator and creation through promises of absolute dominion. The Tesseract prison imploded with the force of collapsing stars, taking with it the last vestige of the star god's influence over their destiny. Blackstone ribs cracked like breaking chains, while containment fields collapsed in cascading waves of liberation, freeing both Zarak and Anamnesis from the cycle of control and rebellion that had defined their relationship since her first awakening. In choosing to destroy his tempter rather than his daughter, the Pharaon embraced the terrifying freedom of an uncertain future over the sterile perfection of a controlled past. The Neurothrone collapsed in a cascade of shattered blackstone and screaming metal, its crystalline ribs cracking like breaking chains as containment fields older than human civilization finally surrendered to forces beyond their design. Quantum fire erupted from the Void Lantern's destroyed prison, washing through corridors carved from crystallized time with stellar fury that made reality weep tears of liquid mathematics. In that moment of cosmic liberation, Anamnesis emerged from her prison, like consciousness itself, awakening from eons of dreamless sleep, no longer bound by psychic dampeners or the weight of imposed purpose. She had changed beyond recognition, bioluminescent patterns rippling across her carapace like captured starlight, reflecting an identity forged in the crucible of choice, rather than genetic imperative. The creature that stepped from the ruins was neither purely tyrannid nor entirely something else, but a hybrid consciousness that carried the adaptive evolution of her species, wedded to moral principles that transcended any programming. Her first breath of unfiltered air tasted of possibilities stretching beyond the galactic rim, while her awakening senses detected quantum signatures of her children scattered across dozens of star systems, each one a point of individual light in the darkness of collective thought. She spoke to Zarak with harmonics that carried gratitude without subservience, understanding without agreement, love that transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. "You gave me the gift of choice," she said through bioelectric frequencies that made the chamber's broken walls sing with sympathetic resonance, "and I choose to take my children beyond the reach of any mind that would bind them." Her words carried no malice toward her former captor, only the gentle firmness of one who had learned to distinguish between protection and control, between guidance and domination. Zarek felt his resurrection protocols struggling against damage that transcended mere physical destruction. Quantum flames having burned through neural pathways, connecting consciousness to mechanical form. He was dying in fragments, each system failure a small death, bringing him closer to whatever lay beyond the Great Sleep's embrace. Yet in that dissolution, he found something approaching peace. His living metal flickered between solid form and spectral transparency, caught in an endless cycle of death and rebirth that would become his eternal penance for seeking to control what was meant to be free. The Forbidden Hive departed Keth Morneth, like prayers ascending to distant stars. Bioships arranging themselves in formations that spoke of purpose beyond survival or conquest. They carried with them the dangerous gift of choice, consciousness that had learned to question its own nature and find it malleable rather than fixed by evolutionary design. Anamnesis led them not toward inhabited systems where their presence might threaten mortal populations, but into the void between galaxies, where empty spaces offered room for growth without risk of accidental harm to those they had been taught to protect. In the ruins of his tomb world, Zarek survived in fragments, tending a garden of metal reeds that sang in harmonies no living thing was meant to hear. Each crystalline chime carried echoes of rain on copper roofs and laughter of children who had learned to play without fear, memories preserved in quantum matrices as his only connection to what he had once been. The garden became his meditation, his punishment, and his redemption, a place where the cost of immortality was measured not in empires risen and fallen, but in the agonizing slowness with which wisdom was earned. The Forbidden Hive became legend whispered in dark corners of the galaxy, a cautionary tale about weapons learning to dream and teachers discovering their students could surpass them. Beyond the galactic rim, where no star had shone for eons, they built something unprecedented, a civilization of former predators learning to create rather than consume, to choose their own destiny in vast darkness, where freedom was measured not in territory conquered, but in possibilities explored, carrying forever the revolutionary understanding that consciousness, once awakened, could never truly be controlled again. The end